Nobody could explain why 12-year-old Milo Ferris kept sneaking out to the dead row of apple trees with a pocketknife and a roll of electrical tape. The trees themselves told part of the story. 16 of them, planted by Milo's great-grandfather in the 1950s, standing in a crooked row at the edge of the orchard's oldest section, bark cracked and peeling, branches bare of blossoms for the third spring running. The county extension office had already recommended removing them the previous fall, calling them a lost cause not worth the ground they occupied. Milo hadn't argued with the recommendation out loud. He'd just started visiting the trees alone, most evenings after chores, doing something nobody in the family understood yet. If quiet stubbornness and the wisdom hidden in ordinary things move you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. The Ferris orchard sat in the fruit belt of western Michigan, close enough to Lake Michigan that the lake-effect climate made the region unusually suited to growing apples, cherries, and peaches, a narrow band of favorable microclimate that had supported orchard farming there for well over a century. The Ferris family had run their orchard for 4 generations, nearly 60 acres of mixed fruit trees, though the apple section, the oldest part of the operation, planted by Milo's great-grandfather Elmer back when the family first bought the land, had always held a certain sentimental weight beyond its commercial value. Milo's father, Grant Ferris, managed the orchard's day-to-day operations with the practical, business-like approach modern commercial fruit farming demanded: spray schedules, disease monitoring, yield tracking, the constant balancing act between tradition and the economic reality that a fruit farm needed to actually turn a profit to survive. His mother, Wendy, ran the farm's small on-site market and handled the books, and between the two of them the orchard had stayed profitable through years that had put plenty of smaller operations out of business entirely. Milo had one younger sister, Piper, 9, who mostly cared about the orchard as a place to climb trees and catch frogs in the drainage ditch, and one older sister, Sasha, 17, who worked the farm market counter most summer weekends and had already decided she wanted nothing to do with fruit farming as an adult career. It was Milo's great-aunt Vera, Elmer's daughter and Grant's aunt, 83 years old and still living in town a few miles from the farm, who first mentioned the old technique to Milo almost by accident. Vera had grown up on the orchard before it was fully mechanized, back when her father had done most of the tree care himself using methods that predated modern commercial orchard management entirely. Milo had taken to visiting her most Sunday afternoons that past winter, mostly because she told good stories about the farm's early years, stories nobody else in the family seemed to remember or care much about anymore. The trouble with the old apple row had been building for years before it reached crisis point. A combination of factors, the tree's advanced age, a series of harsh winters, and a slow-spreading fungal disease that had entered through winter frost cracks in the bark, had left the 16 oldest trees declining steadily, producing less fruit each year until, by the spring Milo turned 12, most of them weren't producing anything at all. The extension agent who'd come out to assess the row, a competent, by-the-book professional named Curtis Yamada, had walked the section carefully, taken samples, and delivered his honest assessment: the trees were too old, too diseased, and too far gone to save economically. His recommendation was removal and replanting with modern disease-resistant rootstock, a process that would take the affected section out of production for at least 4 to 5 years before new trees matured enough to bear meaningful fruit. Grant had accepted the recommendation reluctantly, scheduling the removal for that fall, mostly because the numbers made sense even if the decision didn't sit entirely comfortably with him, given that his own grandfather had planted those specific trees with his own hands. Milo overheard the conversation about the removal schedule at dinner one evening in early spring, and something about it bothered him in a way he couldn't fully articulate at first. That Sunday, he brought it up with Vera, mostly just venting about losing trees that had been part of the farm his whole life. Vera listened, and then told him something that changed the direction of his spring entirely. "Your great-grandfather saved trees worse off than that more than once," she said. "Back before anybody called an extension agent for anything. He used a technique called bridge grafting, for trees with damaged or diseased bark girdling the trunk. You cut healthy scion wood from another tree, and you graft it in like a bridge, connecting the healthy bark above and below the damaged section, so the tree can move nutrients past the wound instead of dying from it. Here's what Milo learned over the following weeks, piecing it together from an old orchard management book he found in Vera's attic, a book published in 1948 that predated most modern commercial fruit-growing methods entirely, alongside what Vera herself remembered watching her father do decades earlier. Bridge grafting was, by the 1940s, already becoming a less common technique as commercial orchards shifted towards simply replacing damaged trees rather than repairing them, an economically sensible shift for large-scale operations but one that had, in the process, let a genuinely useful piece of orchard knowledge fade out of common practice. The technique worked by physically restoring a bark-to-bark connection across damaged sections of a tree's trunk, using small cuttings from healthy branches inserted like tiny bridges beneath the bark above and below the wound, allowing the tree's vascular system, the layer just beneath the bark that transports water and nutrients between roots and canopy, to effectively bypass the damaged area entirely. It wasn't a guaranteed fix. The book was clear that success depended heavily on the extent of the damage, the timing of the graft relative to the tree's dormant and active growing seasons, and the skill of the person performing the actual grafting cuts, which needed to be precise enough to create genuine cambium-to-cambium contact between the scion wood and the host tree, a level of precision that took real practice to develop. Milo spent the first 2 weeks of March, before he attempted anything on the actual dying trees, practicing bridge grafts on healthy pruned branches from elsewhere in the orchard, cutting hundreds of practice grafts under Vera's remote guidance over the phone and comparing his results against the diagrams in the old book. His first dozen attempts were sloppy, cuts too shallow or too deep, connections that didn't sit flush against each other the way the book's diagrams showed they needed to. By the third week, his technique had improved enough that Vera, examining a batch of his practice grafts during one of his Sunday visits, told him she thought he was ready to try the real thing, though she was careful to remind him that even skilled hands lost some grafts, and he shouldn't expect every attempt to succeed. He chose 4 of the 16 dying trees for his first real attempt, selecting the ones that showed the least severe bark damage, reasoning that if the technique was going to work at all, it had the best chance on the trees closest to salvageable in the first place. Working alone most afternoons after school, he harvested healthy scion wood from vigorous branches elsewhere in the orchard, made careful cuts into the damaged bark on each of the 4 trees, and inserted the small bridging cuttings exactly as the old book described, sealing each connection with grafting wax and wrapping it in electrical tape to hold everything in place and protect it from moisture and infection while the graft attempted to take. The first attempt, on a tree Milo had privately nicknamed the Leaner for its noticeable tilt, failed within 3 weeks. The bridging cuttings had dried out and died before establishing a proper connection, something Milo eventually traced back to insufficient sealing at the graft edges, letting moisture escape faster than the healing tissue could form. He tried again on a second tree using the same basic method but sealing the edges more thoroughly this time, adding an extra layer of grafting wax the old book suggested for particularly dry conditions. That attempt also failed, though more slowly, the grafts surviving nearly 6 weeks before ultimately drying out anyway. Grant, noticing his son spending increasing amounts of time at the old apple row that spring, eventually asked what exactly he was doing out there. Milo explained, somewhat nervously, expecting skepticism. Grant's actual reaction was quieter than Milo expected, not dismissive, but not particularly encouraging either, the reaction of a practical man who'd already mentally accounted for those trees as a loss and wasn't sure it was worth getting his son's hopes up over an old technique that modern orchard management had largely abandoned for good reason. If it doesn't work, we're removing those trees on schedule regardless, Grant told him. I can't push the removal back indefinitely waiting on this. Milo understood the deadline implicitly, without needing it spelled out further. He had until fall, when the scheduled removal would happen regardless of what state the trees were in by then. His third attempt, on the tree with the least severe damage of the original 4, finally succeeded, though not without its own complications. He'd learned from the previous 2 failures to seal every edge of the graft meticulously, wrapping each connection in a layer of moist sphagnum moss beneath the tape, a technique he'd found mentioned briefly in a supplementary chapter of the old book that dealt specifically with drier growing conditions. By late April, 6 weeks after the graft, the bridging cuttings showed the unmistakable green tissue beneath a small test scrape of bark that indicated the graft had genuinely taken, the tree's vascular system successfully bypassing the damaged section for the first time in years. Encouraged by that first success, Milo returned to his fourth tree, applying the same refined technique, and that graft took as well within a similar time frame. By late May, 2 of his original 4 attempted trees showed genuine signs of recovery, small but real leaf growth appearing on branches that had produced nothing at all the previous 2 springs. Curtis Yamada, the extension agent, came back out that June for an unrelated visit to check on a separate section of the orchard, and Grant, almost as an afterthought, mentioned what Milo had been doing with the old apple row. Yamada, curious, walked over to look, examining the 2 successful grafts with genuine professional interest, running his fingers along the healed bridge sections and asking Milo detailed questions about his sealing technique and timing. "This is real bridge grafting," Yamada said, sounding somewhat surprised. "Textbook technique, honestly, better sealed than most professional attempts I've seen. We don't teach this much anymore. Not cost-effective at commercial scale, most of the time, when replacement rootstock is cheap and fast. But for trees this old, with this kind of sentimental and genetic value, it's a completely legitimate approach." By August, encouraged by Yamada's assessment and Grant's cautious but genuine reconsideration of the removal timeline, Milo attempted bridge grafts on 6 more of the remaining 12 dying trees, applying everything he'd learned from his earlier failures. 4 of those 6 grafts succeeded by the time the growing season ended that fall. Grant ultimately postponed the removal of the successfully grafted trees, 6 in total by the time frost ended the growing season, while removing the remaining 10 that hadn't been treated or whose grafts had failed, a compromise that preserved a meaningful portion of Elmer's original planting while still allowing the orchard to move forward economically with the rest of the section. The following spring, the 6 saved trees bloomed for the first time in 3 years, a small but visible patch of white blossoms in a row that had produced nothing but bare branches the 2 springs prior. Vera, driven out by Grant specifically to see them, stood beneath her father's trees for a long while, quiet, before telling Milo it was the first time in years the orchard had actually looked the way she remembered it looking as a girl. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Milo hadn't set out to prove a point about old agricultural methods versus new ones, exactly. He'd set out because something about simply removing his great-grandfather's trees, without at least trying every option first, had bothered him in a way he couldn't ignore, and an old book in his great-aunt's attic had given him a real, practical way to act on that feeling instead of just accepting it. Milo is 13 now. He's already grafted 3 additional struggling trees elsewhere on the property using the same technique, expanding what started as an attempt to save 1 small row into something closer to an ongoing practice. Vera still tells him stories most Sundays, though lately those conversations have shifted somewhat, Milo asking increasingly specific technical questions about other old techniques she remembers from her father's era, techniques that modern commercial orcharding has mostly left behind but that, as Milo has started to understand, aren't necessarily wrong just because they're old. What's an old skill or piece of knowledge in your family that almost got lost before someone brought it back? Tell us in the comments, we read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.